4 minutes. That is all it took. 4 minutes on the morning of June the 4th, 1942, to shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility, to break the back of the most powerful carrier fleet the world had ever seen, and to turn the entire course of the Second World War in the Pacific. In 4 minutes, 3 aircraft carriers that had helped burn Pearl Harbor to the waterline were transformed into floating infernos. Men who had believed, absolutely believed, that they were winning a war, watched their ships die beneath them in a hell of fire and twisted steel. This is the story of how a handful of tired, outnumbered, outgunned American sailors and aviators, fighting with obsolete planes and broken codes, reached into the heart of the Japanese Empire and tore out its future. This is the story of the Battle of Midway. To understand how the world arrived at this single blistering morning in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, we have to go back 6 months to the 7th of December, 1941. That morning, in the calm blue waters off the island of Oahu, Japanese carrier aircraft descended upon the American fleet at Pearl Harbor in a devastating surprise attack. Battleships were sunk, over 2,000 Americans were killed. The United States Pacific Fleet, the supposed guardian of American power in the Pacific, was crippled in under 2 hours. It was by any measure a catastrophic defeat, and yet it was also, in the cold calculus of naval warfare, an incomplete one. The American aircraft carriers, the ships that would prove to be the true kings of the Pacific War, were not in port that day. USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea, untouched, unscathed, and utterly critical to everything that would follow. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant and deeply conflicted commander of Japan's combined fleet, understood this better than anyone. Yamamoto had studied in the United States. He had seen American industry, American oil fields, American shipyards. He knew, in a way that many of his more zealous countrymen did not want to hear, that Japan could not win a long war against the United States. His entire strategy, from the very first moment the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, was built around a desperate gamble: cripple the American fleet so badly, so completely, that Japan could seize the resources of the Pacific, dig into a defensive perimeter, and force the United States to accept a negotiated peace before American industrial might could be fully mobilized. Yamamoto reportedly said that Japan would run wild for 6 months to a year, but that he had utter confidence for the first year, and no confidence at all for the second or third. Pearl Harbor had bought time. It had not bought victory, and with 3 American carriers still afloat, the war Yamamoto feared most, a long, grinding war of attrition against American industry, remained horribly possible. For the next several months, Japan seemed unstoppable. The Philippines fell. Wake Island fell. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in one of the worst defeats in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, with their vital oil, fell under Japanese control. Burma was invaded. A Japanese carrier task force even raided into the Indian Ocean, sinking British ships and forcing the Royal Navy to retreat. Japan's combined fleet, and in particular its 6 fleet carriers, known collectively as the Kido Butai, seemed to be an unstoppable force of nature, sweeping across half the globe with a speed and violence that stunned military planners in London and Washington alike. And then, on the 18th of April, 1942, something happened that changed everything. 16 American B-25 Mitchell bombers, land-based aircraft never designed to take off from an aircraft carrier, roared off the deck of USS Hornet and struck the Japanese home islands directly, bombing Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. The Doolittle raid, named for its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, did little real physical damage. But psychologically, it was a thunderclap. For the first time, the Japanese homeland, the sacred soil that had never been touched by a foreign enemy, had been bombed. The Japanese high command, and Yamamoto in particular, were humiliated, and that humiliation hardened into a fierce determination. Yamamoto had already been planning an operation to draw the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them once and for all. After the Doolittle raid, that plan gained a new, more desperate urgency and a target. A tiny speck of coral and sand in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called Midway Atoll. Midway was not much to look at. Two small islands, Sand and Eastern, sitting inside a coral reef, roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. But its location made it strategically priceless. Midway sat astride the approaches to the Hawaiian Islands, and whoever controlled it controlled a crucial forward base for reconnaissance and attack. Yamamoto's plan, sprawling complex in the way that so many Japanese operations of this period were, called for a diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands in the far north to draw American attention away. While the main striking force, four of Japan's finest fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, would smash Midway's defenses from the air, and an invasion force would land and seize the atoll. When the American Pacific Fleet, its remaining carriers, inevitably surged out from Pearl Harbor to defend Midway, Yamamoto's overwhelming battleship strength, including the mighty Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, would arrive to finish them off in a grand, decisive surface battle, the kind of climactic clash that Japanese naval doctrine had dreamed of for decades. It was an enormous, powerful, and, on paper, almost unbeatable plan. Japan would be committing something in the range of 200 ships to the operation, an armada so vast it would take days just to sail past a single point. Against this, the United States Navy could muster 3 aircraft carriers, if that, and this is where the story takes its first great turn. Because before a single shot was fired, before a single aircraft left a single deck, the Battle of Midway had already, in a very real sense, begun to be decided. It was being decided not on the open ocean, but in a windowless basement beneath the administration building at Pearl Harbor. In a cramped, poorly ventilated room filled with the hum of machinery and the quiet, obsessive focus of a small team of Navy codebreakers. This was Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's combat intelligence unit, led by a brilliant, eccentric, and famously irritable officer named Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort and his team had spent months painstakingly chipping away at the Japanese Navy's main operational code, known to the Americans as JN-25. It was slow, maddening work, piecing together fragments of intercepted radio traffic, statistical patterns, educated guesses, building a partial picture of Japanese intentions one scrap at a time. By May of 1942, Rochefort's team had picked up chatter, referring to an upcoming operation against a target designated only by the code letters AF. Rochefort was almost certain AF meant Midway, but almost certain was not good enough. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed proof, because if Rochefort was wrong and the Pacific Fleet's precious carriers sailed the wrong direction, the result could be catastrophic, potentially even the end of American naval power in the Pacific for the rest of the war. So Rochefort's team devised a brilliantly simple trick. They had the garrison at Midway send a message, deliberately uncoded, complaining that their freshwater distillation equipment had broken down. Within days, Japanese radio traffic was intercepted reporting that AF was short of fresh water. It was confirmation. Midway was the target. This piece of intelligence, this single confirmed fact pulled from an ocean of intercepted static, would prove to be one of the most consequential code-breaking achievements in the history of warfare. Nimitz now knew not only where the Japanese were going to strike, but roughly when and with what forces. He knew the size of the strike force, the general timeline, even elements of the order of battle. It was as if Yamamoto's meticulously guarded battle plan had been laid open on Nimitz's desk. and Nimitz, a calm, decisive, and quietly aggressive commander, made a choice that would define the entire battle. Instead of waiting passively at Pearl Harbor for the Japanese to arrive, he would use this priceless intelligence to set a trap. There was, however, a problem, and it was a serious one. The United States Pacific Fleet had only 3 carriers available. Enterprise and Hornet were operational and ready, but Yorktown, the 3rd carrier, had just returned from the brutal Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in early May, the first naval battle in history in which opposing ships never sighted one another, with all the fighting done entirely by carrier aircraft. Coral Sea had been a strategic American victory, forcing back a Japanese invasion force headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea, and, crucially, it had also cost Japan the temporary loss of 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku, damaged and under repair, and Zuikaku, which had lost so many aircraft and pilots that it could not be made ready in time for Midway. This meant that, unknown to Yamamoto, his overwhelming carrier advantage had already been quietly whittled down. Instead of 6 carriers for the Midway operation, he would have only 4. But Yorktown herself had come out of Coral Sea badly wounded, with an enormous hole torn in her flight deck and significant damage below the waterline. Naval engineers estimated it would take 90 days in a proper dockyard to make her fully seaworthy again. Nimitz did not have 90 days. He had, by the time Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor, roughly 72 hours. Nimitz walked the dry dock himself, inspecting the damage, and gave an order that has become legendary in naval history: get her ready to fight. Around the clock, in showers of sparks, with welders and fitters working in 3 shifts without rest, the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard performed what amounted to a medical miracle, patching, welding, and shoring up Yorktown well enough to sail and fight, not perfectly repaired, but functional. It was an extraordinary display of American industrial improvisation, and it meant that Nimitz would be able to send not 2, but 3 carriers to meet the Japanese fleet. Command of this small striking force fell to 2 men. Task Force 16, built around Enterprise and Hornet, would be led by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a quiet, analytical, almost cerebral officer who had never commanded a carrier task force in combat before, but who would prove in the coming battle to possess an almost uncanny sense of timing and risk. Spruance had been given command somewhat by circumstance, stepping in for the legendary and fiercely aggressive Admiral William Halsey, who had been hospitalized with a severe skin condition just before the battle. Halsey, in one of the most important personnel decisions of the entire Pacific War, personally recommended Spruance as his replacement. Task Force 17, built around the freshly patched Yorktown, would be commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the senior officer of the 2, and overall tactical commander of the American forces at sea. On the 28th and 30th of May, the American carrier task forces slipped quietly out of Pearl Harbor and took up position northeast of Midway, at a location the Americans nicknamed Point Luck. It was a chillingly appropriate name because for all of Rochefort's brilliant code-breaking, for all of Nimitz's careful planning, an enormous amount would still come down to luck, timing, courage, and the split-second decisions of individual pilots flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. By the 1st of June, the Japanese armada was steaming toward Midway in a vast, sprawling formation. Yamamoto's own battleship force trailed hundreds of miles behind the carriers. A decision, driven by a desire for secrecy and surprise, that would prove absolutely crucial because it meant the overwhelming firepower of the Japanese battle line, the ships that could have annihilated Midway's defenses or turned the tide of any surface engagement, would be too far away to influence the coming carrier battle at all. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the 4-carrier strike force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was the same officer who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. He was a torpedo and destroyer specialist by training, not a naval aviator. a fact that some historians believe left him less instinctively comfortable with the split-second, high-stakes decisions that carrier warfare demanded. He would need every ounce of that instinct in the hours to come. At dawn on the 4th of June, Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway itself. Over 100 aircraft, bombers and fighters, roaring off the decks of the four carriers to soften up the atoll's defenses ahead of the planned invasion. Midway's defenders, forewarned by American intelligence and reinforced with additional aircraft and anti-aircraft guns in the days before the battle, fought back desperately. Marine fighter pilots, flying badly outdated Brewster Buffalo aircraft, hopelessly outclassed by the nimble Japanese Zero, threw themselves at the incoming bombers anyway and paid a horrific price. Many shot down in their first pass. It was a brutal, one-sided fight in the air over Midway, but it accomplished something vital. It slowed the Japanese down, it forced them to expend fuel and ammunition, and it confirmed for the strike leader over the target that a second attack wave against Midway's ground installations would be necessary to fully neutralize the base. This single tactical judgment call, radioed back to Nagumo's flagship Akagi, would trigger one of the most consequential and controversial decisions of the entire battle. Nagumo had kept a reserve strike force on his carriers, armed and ready in case American ships were spotted. But now, faced with a report that Midway needed a second bombing run, and with no confirmed sighting of American ships nearby, Nagumo made the fateful decision to have his ground crews rearm the reserve aircraft, currently loaded with armor-piercing torpedoes and bombs meant for enemy warships, with general-purpose bombs suited for a second strike against Midway's airfields and fortifications instead. It was, given the information available to him at that moment, not an unreasonable decision, but it would set off a chain of events that would prove utterly disastrous for the Japanese Navy. Because at almost exactly the moment this rearming operation began, at 7:45 in the morning, a Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone, a plane that had, due to a mechanical delay, launched a full half-hour later than it should have, finally radioed back a report. Enemy ship sighted. It took another agonizing hour for a follow-up report to confirm the presence of what appeared to be an American aircraft carrier among the ships. For Nagumo, this was catastrophic news delivered at the worst possible moment. His flight decks were in chaos, crews scrambling to reverse the rearming process yet again, hauling torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs back up from the magazines, while aircraft returning from the first Midway strike were also circling overhead, low on fuel, desperate to land. Nagumo faced an agonizing choice: launch an immediate but weak and disorganized strike against the American carrier with whatever aircraft happened to be ready, or take the time to properly recover his returning strike aircraft, rearm and refuel everything correctly, and launch one single, powerful, coordinated blow. He chose to wait, to do it properly. It was, in the context of Japanese carrier doctrine, a defensible decision. It also meant that for the next hour, the decks of all four Japanese carriers would be a nightmarish tangle of fully fueled aircraft, torpedoes, bombs, and ammunition scattered across the hangar decks, an extraordinarily vulnerable state, a floating powder keg waiting for a single spark. The Americans, meanwhile, had already spotted the Japanese fleet, and Fletcher and Spruance made their move. Beginning around 7 o'clock that morning, wave after wave of American carrier aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter escort began launching from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, and turning west toward the reported position of the Japanese carriers. What followed was, for the first several hours, an American disaster in the making. Squadron after squadron of American aircraft failed to find the enemy fleet, whose position had shifted since the initial contact report, and some units became hopelessly separated in the vast, empty ocean. And then, tragically, gloriously, came the attack of the American torpedo bomber squadrons. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from Hornet, found the Japanese carriers first. 15 slow, lumbering Devastator torpedo bombers, aircraft already considered obsolete, with no fighter escort, because their escorting fighters had become separated during the search, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, a fiercely determined officer who had reportedly told his men before takeoff that he would fly to the enemy alone if he had to, and that if there was only one plane left to make a final run in, he wanted that to be him. The squadron pressed home its attack against the massed anti-aircraft fire of the entire Japanese fleet and a swarm of defending Zero fighters. Every single one of the 15 Devastators of Torpedo 8 was shot down. Not one torpedo hit its target. Of the 30 men who flew that morning with Torpedo 8, only one survived. Ensign George Gay, who watched the rest of the battle unfold from a small raft in the water, hiding beneath his seat cushion to avoid strafing Japanese aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next and suffered nearly as horrifically. 10 of its 14 aircraft shot down, again without a single torpedo hit. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown went in, and again, the vast majority were shot out of the sky. In the space of roughly an hour, the United States Navy's torpedo bomber squadrons had been almost entirely annihilated, dozens of young American aviators killed, and not a single Japanese ship had been seriously damaged. From a purely tactical standpoint, in that hour, it looked like an unmitigated American catastrophe, a slaughter, with nothing gained. But it was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. Because the Japanese carriers, in fending off wave after wave of these low, slow torpedo attacks, had been forced to turn hard and repeatedly, and their combat air patrol of Zero fighters had been drawn down to sea level, chasing and destroying the American torpedo planes, burning fuel, using ammunition, and, most critically of all, leaving the skies high above the fleet almost completely undefended. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had, without any of the men who flew them ever knowing it, set the perfect trap. And into that empty sky entirely by chance arrived Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. McCluskey commanded the dive bomber group from Enterprise, 37 dauntless dive bombers, that had also failed to find the enemy fleet at its expected position and were running desperately low on fuel, on the verge of having to turn back or ditch in the ocean. McCluskey made it a decision that has since become one of the most celebrated judgment calls in American naval history. Instead of turning back, he chose to continue searching a little longer, following a hunch, and then spotted the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer racing north at high speed, the destroyer Arashi, which had been left behind to depth charge an American submarine and was now rushing to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey gambled that the destroyer's course would lead him directly to Nagumo's carriers. He was right. Minutes later, his dive bombers crested the horizon and looked down to sea, spread out below them, almost entirely undefended by fighter cover. The decks of Akagi and Kaga crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft. At almost exactly the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived independently over the third carrier, Soryu. What happened in the next few minutes has been described, again and again, by historians as the 5 most consequential minutes in naval history. The American dauntless dive bombers, screaming down in near vertical dives from over 14,000 feet, released their bombs onto decks that had absolutely no chance to launch fighters, or clear the deadly cargo of fuel and ordnance scattered across their hangars. Akagi was hit, and the resulting explosions, fed by fuel lines and stacked bombs, tore the great carrier apart from within, a fire so uncontrollable that within hours she would have to be abandoned. Kaga was struck multiple times and suffered an almost identical fate, ripped open by internal explosions, burning uncontrollably. Soryu, hit by Leslie's dive bombers, suffered the same horrific chain reaction. In the span of just a few minutes, 3 of Japan's finest fleet carriers, the very ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, ships that had seemed utterly invincible only hours before, were transformed into blazing wrecks, doomed regardless of anything anyone could do to save them. Only Hiryu, the fourth carrier, positioned somewhat apart from the others, escaped the initial onslaught, and her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, one of the most aggressive and capable officers in the Japanese Navy, immediately launched a furious counterattack. Japanese dive bombers found and struck Yorktown, tearing into her flight deck and engine spaces, leaving her dead in the water and burning. A second wave of torpedo bombers from Hiryu followed hours later and struck Yorktown again, this time with torpedoes that flooded her engineering spaces and caused her to list so severely that her captain gave the order to abandon ship, fearing she would capsize. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed as though Japan might yet salvage something from the disaster, having traded one American carrier for 3 of their own. But American reconnaissance had located Hiryu, and that afternoon, dive bombers launched from Enterprise, including several orphaned aircraft from the wounded Yorktown, found the 4th and final Japanese fleet carrier and subjected her to the same devastating treatment, repeated direct hits, triggering the same catastrophic internal explosions and fires that had already consumed her 3 sister ships. By nightfall on the 4th of June, all 4 of Japan's fleet carriers at Midway were sinking or burning wrecks, doomed beyond saving. Admiral Yamaguchi, in keeping with the fierce traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy, chose to go down with his ship rather than survive its loss. Along with Hiryu's captain, Yamamoto, receiving the reports of this unimaginable disaster aboard his flagship far to the west, initially refused to believe the scale of what had happened. He considered pressing forward with his battleships in a desperate attempt to force a night surface engagement, hoping to salvage the situation with the combined fleet's remaining overwhelming gunpower. But with his carrier air cover gone, and Spruance wisely declining to be lured into a night battle against superior Japanese battleships and cruisers, choosing instead to withdraw eastward to protect his own remaining carriers, Yamamoto ultimately accepted the inevitable. On the 5th of June, he ordered the invasion of Midway canceled, and the shattered remnants of his once magnificent carrier strike force turned for home. The cost had been staggering and almost entirely one-sided. Japan lost all 4 of its fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with the heavy cruiser Makuma, sunk during the retreat by follow-up American airstrikes. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were killed, including many of the Navy's most experienced and irreplaceable carrier pilots and mechanics, men whose skill and training could not simply be replaced by throwing new aircraft off an assembly line. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown, finally sunk on the 7th of June by a Japanese submarine, while under tow after the battle, along with the destroyer Hammond and roughly 300 sailors and airmen killed, a devastating toll for the men and families involved, but a fraction of the losses suffered by Japan. It is difficult to overstate how completely this single battle altered the trajectory of the war in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan held the strategic initiative virtually everywhere, expanding at will, choosing where and when to strike. After Midway, that initiative shifted permanently to the United States. Japan would never again be able to field the same overwhelming carrier force it had possessed in the first 6 months of the war. American industrial power, that vast, terrifying capacity that Yamamoto had so feared, now had time to build new carriers, train new pilots, and mobilize the full might of the American economy for total war. Just 2 months later, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal, beginning a grinding 6-month campaign that marked the start of a long, brutal, but now unstoppable American offensive that would not end until the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay 3 years later. Historians have argued for decades about exactly how much of this outcome was inevitable and how much came down to sheer chance. The mechanical failure that delayed a single scout plane's launch by half an hour. The fortunate discovery of a lone destroyer's wake by a squadron running dangerously low on fuel. The almost simultaneous arrival of two separate American dive bomber groups over an undefended fleet within the same 5 minutes. Some call it a miracle. Others point out that the miracle was built on a foundation of extraordinary human effort and sacrifice. The brutal, unglamorous work of codebreakers in a basement, the desperate courage of torpedo pilots, who flew, essentially, to their deaths without hesitation, the round-the-clock labor of shipyard workers who defied engineering estimates to get a broken carrier back into the fight, and the calm, careful judgment of commanders like Nimitz and Spruance, who took a calculated gamble against a vastly superior force and refused to blink. What is beyond argument is the result. In one single, brutal morning, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the balance of power in the greatest naval conflict in human history shifted forever. 4 aircraft carriers, ships that had taken years and enormous national resources to build, and that carried within them thousands of hours of irreplaceable pilot training and experience, were destroyed in the span of a single coordinated American strike. The Battle of Midway did not end the war in the Pacific. There were still 3 long, terrible years of fighting ahead, island by island, ship by ship, at a cost in human life that is almost impossible to comprehend. But Midway ensured that Japan would fight the rest of that war on the defensive, reacting rather than dictating, retreating rather than advancing. It was the turning point, the hinge upon which the entire war swung. And it was won not by overwhelming force, but by intelligence, by daring, by sacrifice, and, yes, by a measure of luck that history rarely grants to anyone. Today, the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Yorktown lie thousands of feet beneath the Pacific, discovered by modern deep-sea expeditions decades after the battle. Silent and rusting monuments to a single, extraordinary morning that changed the course of human history. The men who fought that day on both sides are almost all gone now, but the story of what they did, the courage of the torpedo pilots who attacked knowing they likely would not return, the discipline of the codebreakers who cracked an enemy's most guarded secrets, the nerve of the commanders who gambled everything on a single roll of the dice, remains one of the greatest and most consequential stories in the entire history of warfare. So, here's the question I want to leave you with. Given everything you now know, the intelligence breakthroughs, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, the sheer luck of timing, do you believe the American victory at Midway was truly a masterpiece of strategy and codebreaking, or was it, at its heart, one of the greatest strokes of pure battlefield luck in military history? I would genuinely love to read your answer in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most pivotal battles of the Second World War, do me a simple favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell, because there are many more stories like this one still to come. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.